This is Mat Marquis. He is chair of the Responsive Images community group, which started kind of nearish the same time, a little bit earlier than the extensible web group that I chaired. And they did responsive images. And that was done in a way that was completely different, which Matt may talk about. And that's sort of the model that we're trying to do. So I'll just hand it over to Matt and let Matt tell you about what's next. All you, Matt.
Excellent. I should probably unmute myself before beginning the presentation. That's an old speaker's trick that I picked up. All right, we got a screen over there. Everything good?
Yep.
Cool. So yeah, just in case anybody came trickling in after I said it before, this isn't the most formal of presentations in the world. If anybody has a question midstream, feel free. Might be a little hard to track auditorially if everybody's just shouting them up, but I don't know, maybe throw a hand up and Brian, you can relay something like that.
Sure,
I don't know. I'm making all this up as I go along.
Yeah, we'll mediate
So yes,
as we get any questions.
Say again, sorry?
I said, yeah, when you're ready to have like more open discussion, we'll mediate the questions.
Okay. Okay, cool. So yeah, Mat Marquis, regrettably will tell on Twitter, in so much as Twitter is just a generally regrettable experience these days. I am a developer at Boku, formerly a designy developer at Filament Group, and I am the chair of the Responsive Issues community group. And I am here today to talk about a massive failure in CSS clothing. So originally, at the outset of the community group, we were just a fistful of nerds in an Etherpad that I don't believe still exists. We just finished up working on the Boston Globe website, and a pretty big issue we identified early on was in this crazy new stretchy layout world of ours. It seemed like we had a whole host of new performance issues that we hadn't really had opportunity to think through prior to these wild stretchy layouts. The biggest of which was images. For an image that's meant to occupy a space in a layout that could be anywhere from 300 pixels wide to 2,000 pixels wide, the only real solution we had was to use a 2,000 pixel wide source image and scale it up and down visually, which worked fine in terms of looking at it, but in terms of the actual asset being transferred, that still means serving that 2,000 pixel wide source image to everybody, regardless of context. That's even more problematic when the smaller display that'll see no benefit from that enormous source that's being scaled down, at least at the time, was usually at like a bandwidth premium. This was original iPhones or a few versions in at that stage. So we got together, just a group of developers, before there was any sort of like web standards outreach to groups of developers and designers, and we started just kind of riffing on ideas for like, let's say we had a native solution to this. We tried a bunch of things using JavaScript. We tried a bunch of things using CSS, and none of them were really satisfactory. So let's say in theory, we had a native solution to this. What might that look like? Let's think about that and sort of tailor our solutions to that. We came up with a lot of good ideas, but nothing that we could actually like translate back to JavaScript. Nothing that didn't rely so heavily on the browser internals that it wasn't feasible for us to build anything. So this was, for a bunch of us, our introduction to web standards. I said, okay, I guess this is it. We've hit an impasse. We're real good at solving problems, but this one we cannot solve. So we wade into a bunch of arcane mailing lists, and we say, hey, exciting news. We thought this through a lot. We have some really cool ideas. We're excited to work with you, web standards. And we're rebuffed, I'll say. Oh God, screen went away. That's not great.
We're good. It's back.
They're back? Okay. Yeah, this was, I mean, if I'm being totally candid, if every one of you can keep a secret, we signed on with the What Working group and said, hey, we've got a neato keen idea, help us make it real. And we're all but kicked out. Around this time, the W3C started their community groups effort, which was very much targeted towards groups of designers and developers who have a good idea to sort of think things through and incubate that idea a little bit. It was a venue that was presented as a place for the us to offer feedback to the them of web standards on efforts that are beyond our day-to-day control. But it sort of gave us somewhere to have a voice a little bit. This still went very poorly, I don't mind saying. The earliest iteration of the community groups was just a WordPress blog where we could post some stuff into the void and not really get any feedback in response. Or when we did, we got solutions in the form of ideal conditions, like what would work best on paper, or best case, what would work for a side project over which a developer had like total control, absent any form of CMS. People who worked in web standards full time were almost exclusively aiming to shape these features in terms of what would be considered theoretical purity by anybody who actually built websites full time, whether they realized they were doing it or not. So it was around this time that we bucked the system entirely. What we were doing in the original community groups as they were put forth was not productive. It was actually leading to unworkable, impractical solutions as we made noise about this being a problem, and standards bodies set out to fix it completely independent of our feedback. So the RICG kind of became web standards pirate radio. We published use cases documents, we drafted specifications, we made ourselves the rally point for anybody who was interested in taking on this topic. We built Picture Fill, which followed the spirit of the Extensible Web Manifesto before the Extensible Web Manifesto existed. This became the de facto responsive images polyfill once these standards were implemented. But prior to that, it was just data attributes and divs and spans as we sort of figured out how this thing might work. So we could draft baby's first specification around something that we could actually point at. This got us nowhere either. This was proving the demand. People were using our experiment in production websites against our telling them not to. It proved the need, but there was no one to prove the need to. There was nobody listening. So we then hauled off and we raised $15,000 from the designer and developer community so we could hire an implementer, hire a developer full-time as the RICG to implement this feature in Blink and WebKit, in the rendering engine that powers Chrome and Safari. Thanks to Pittsburgh's own Cotton Bureau, we also, I don't mind saying, had far and away the best t-shirts in the web standards game. Oh yeah. Bring them back. Somebody click on those things, bring those shirts back. Mine are all wearing holes in them. Ultimately, we as the RICG, we published a specification, something we had absolutely no right to do. We were not a standards body by any stretch of the imagination. But we wrote a spec, and after we'd made enough noise, after we'd raised $15,000, after we'd printed dozens and dozens of t-shirts, and we had something like 350, maybe 400 signed up members of the Responsive Images community group at the time, browsers started taking notice of us. They started contributing valuable feedback. We had the momentum on our side. We were making better progress than the standards bodies themselves on standardizing this. And so they kind of threw in with us. The resulting markup was gnarly, to say the absolute least, and we don't need to get into that here. But part of this effort was that members of the RICG went on to spearhead efforts to integrate responsive images into all of the major CMSs, and those features have landed since. WordPress alone powers more than a quarter of the web, and responsive images are just part of the WordPress core. That's something that just comes with every installation of WordPress. These changes to the web platform have saved users untold bandwidth over the past few years, and it does it in a way that average developers don't even need to think about it. It would be easy to think of this as a success story, but it absolutely is not. We made a tremendous amount of progress, the RICG, but we did it in a way that wasn't reproducible. Browsers who weren't interested in the standard at first stayed the bottleneck for the standard, despite the popularity of picture fill, despite that being more than enough to prove the demand. There was no way to effectively communicate that demand to browser vendors. We asked for feedback, and we got almost none until we became a marketing point. Browsers only paid attention in earnest once we raised $15,000. That's a process most ideas on the web aren't going to be able to repeat. So when the time came to shift our focus to another feature, I had high hopes that nobody would need us. I hoped that the RICG wouldn't be necessary at all, that we'd started to create the sort of web standards inroads that meant everyday designers and developers could have their voices heard. I figured maybe it would be helpful if we kicked off a little bit of paperwork, if we made a little bit of noise on some blog posts, and then just let things materialize the way they were going to materialize. We hoped we still had browser vendors' ears enough that we could get this feature done without wading into the weeds like we did the last time. But that was not necessarily the case. So I gave, Brian, you were there, I gave some smaller version of this presentation to the tag, including, I can't say his name, but it rhymes with Tim Berners Fee. I issued this presentation to him and the tag as a warning. I said, I absolutely will orchestrate us doing all this again, and I will hate every moment of it. Fix this. Make it so we don't need to do this pirate radio web standards thing ever again, so these venues exist. But in the meantime, stuff needs to get done. And while those inroads are being created, and you've Brian right in front of you is working on it as we speak, let me talk a little bit about what we are aiming to do, hopefully in a less pirate radio way. Gesundheit. Container queries. I can't do a show of hands, but like, Brian, give me like a rough number of hands that go up. Who has heard about container queries? Like just as a thing that could be.
Half the room.
Oh, no joke. Okay, review for about half the room real quick. And this is taken from the use cases document that we started cobbling together for container queries. The use case for this is, in a way, a lot simpler than responsive images, which had to deal with viewport width and viewport height and pixel density and, you know, image type, et cetera, et cetera. This is strictly a layout tool. This is 100% CSS, and it's going to be really familiar if you're familiar with media queries at all. Let's say, in some form of pattern library tool, Brad Frost, you have these independent modules that can occupy a number of different places in a page layout. This is one breakpoint for these modules. It's either what we'll call, layout A we'll call the vertical layout, and layout B we'll call the horizontal layout. You could probably get away with doing this with the little tricky floats and position absolutes, but let's say there's a media query to break those up. If we're handed a set of wireframes that these are meant to occupy, this is probably a pretty familiar situation, if a little bit, you know, bland to look at. At our smallest breakpoint, these are all going to be the vertical layout. That makes a lot of sense. At an intermediary breakpoint, we're going to have the 3-up arrangement will all be vertical to make better use of that space. And the last 2 are going to break side by side using the horizontal layout. Once we get up to our largest breakpoint, they're all going to use the horizontal layout to take better advantage of that space. This is not hard to do, CSS-wise. I am willing to bet almost all of us have been in a situation kind of like this. The vertical layout is our non-media query styles. That's just how they work by default. We add one media query to... oh, dogs, sorry. Delightful. I have dogs. Where was I? We add We add a media query for the horizontal layout, which is easy enough. And then to deal with the fact that it needs to occupy a couple of different places in the layout, we have a second media query, which is going to have everything scoped to like a class on the parent of those two side by side. Where it gets particularly gross, and I do not have a solution for this for as much as I have been writing CSS, is when we're handed a new comp that calls for that same module to occupy a brand new place in the layout. So in this example, it's in a sidebar. Since none of our previous styles accounted for that being over in a sidebar that way, we now have to add a whole new set of styles scoped to the class of that sidebar. Either a bunch of redundant styles, or we have to use a preprocessor to set up a bunch of this and output this same gnarly, really redundant CSS. Oh, I did my slides out of order too. The point of container queries is to do away with this entirely, to allow you to write styles that are scoped to a parent element, the element itself, rather than media query styles that are scoped to the viewport, if that makes sense. So whatever size this element needs to occupy in the layout, if our style says for this element itself, above 250 pixels wide, for example, use the horizontal layout. If this element itself is below 250 pixels wide, use the vertical layout. What that means is an actually modular module, something you could drop into any place in the layout and have it reflow in a way that makes sense, completely independent of the viewport. If you had to adjust, say on this comp, the width of that sidebar, you wouldn't have to go through and run down the whole cascade and readjust the size of every module that's within that sidebar. Those modules just reflow the way they're meant to. As you might imagine, this has tremendous appeal to people. This is all of the power of media queries on a granular level throughout everything you do in your layouts. And I bring up pattern libraries, not just to, Pastor Brad Frost, but because that's been a huge stumbling block. I mean, for me personally anyway, is that no matter how well crafted these individual modules are, when it comes time to use them in production, I need to know everything about the layout they're going to occupy. I can't really build them completely independent of the page layout. With container queries, I could. So once again, demand is there. The demand is extremely there. But we're still all just kind of shouting into the void on this. There's really no venue to get that information across to the browser vendors. So once again, and with some regret, because ask me at a conference over a beer sometime and I will explain to you how delightful it is to spearhead a major web standards effort when you're not actually a web standards body. With some regret, this is going to be the RICG's new undertaking. We're going to try and act as a rally point, the same way we did for responsive images, but for container queries. We're going to work on the paperwork as best we can. We're all just stumbling through it. We're not full-time web standards folks. But hopefully we've created a few inroads where we can get feedback more quickly this time than we did the last time. So this is my one and only call to action. All this work is taking place in the open on GitHub. The very first thing we need to do as we're hashing out the use cases document, same thing we did with responsive images, is nail down some of the requirements. And that doesn't mean the syntax, and that doesn't mean any number of gritty details. The requirements are what the thing must do and what it cannot do. So this thread, this is up now, and I just commented on there with some examples of the kind of information that would be good to have in here for as much as I know about web standards, which is not all that much. Have a look, have a read through, see if anything jumps out at you, and if you want to get involved in this effort, this is the place to do it. This is the first place to do it. And if you look very closely, at the bottom right, you'll see a tiny new Slack icon on ricg.io. Probably consider clicking on that. Things may not get too noisy right away because some of us have client work to do, But soon, some things are going to be kicking off in earnest. So that's it. That is legit the entire presentation, part of the presentation. And
So,
here's me. I'm back for Q&A.
so let me ask the first question. So,
Yes.
this, like you heard in my talk, when I was saying this kind of thing happens frequently. So when we first started doing responsive design, everybody got to a certain point where they said, okay, I have all these breakpoints, but now I want to say it should be 50% of that thing that it's in. And like everybody hit that. And you would talk to your friend and you would say, how do I do this thing? I must be stupid because I can't figure it out, right? And they would say, no, I have the exact same problem. So like everybody has this problem. And a number of people originally started calling it element queries because it was about the element that it's in. Since it's been container queries now, and I was wondering if maybe you had something you wanted to say about that?
I sure do.
Okay.
I sure do. Thank you for teeing that up for me. Let me just take the noise-making toy away from the dog very casually. He's a good boy. Yeah, no, that's for sure a very real thing, because you're going to see this talked about a lot, especially on Twitter, as either element queries or container queries. Originally, we were calling it element queries because it sort of does what it says on the tin. Whatever size the element is, style the element. This was... resistance isn't the right word. This was met with Eldritch Cthulhu-style horror from browser vendors. The idea of being able to style something and have those styles controlled by their own styles was terrifying to them. Because what that meant was you could use a container or an element query to set a width on an element that would trigger an element query that would change the width of that element back, that would no longer trigger that element query, and so on and so forth in Doctor Who episode. So it became container queries like strictly in name because that was way less terrifying. Style these child elements based on the size of their container was like, okay, this could have potential. This is a thing that could work. But anything that even hinted at an element styling itself based on itself was a non-starter. Like when it first came up, they were like, these can't exist. These cannot exist. And then eventually somebody was like, what if you just call them container queries and it'll go better? And I was like, all right, yeah, let's say that. And they were like, oh yeah, no, that's a lot more feasible. We can talk about those. So yeah, this is the kind of tacit web standards knowledge that only comes with a 3-year slog through responsive images, I guess.
So you all understand that challenge, right?
Client work, baby.
Mm.
No, do you all understand the challenge of so in CSS, right, you have the element tree, the DOM tree. And then you have this other thing that's the box tree that you don't get to see and touch that, but that's the thing that CSS figures out how to draw that thing, right? You may have found yourself like in some situations in the past where you're like, well, how big should that thing be? And the answer is, well, it should be as big as its children, right? Like its children define its size. Yeah. And then there's other times when you say, well, no, it should be the parent that sets it up, right? And so those two things are sort of mutually exclusive, right? It has to be one or the other.
Right.
It can be both. And so one of the problems you get in CSS with a lot of really good ideas is that you can create nonsense, right? Like, so you can say, this thing can. This thing should be 300 pixels wide, or when this thing is 300 pixels wide, I want you to apply this rule. And then the rule says it should be 400 pixels wide. And then you have another rule that says when this thing is 400 pixels wide, this should be 300 pixels wide. So you just create effectively a recursive loop that goes on forever. And CSS is really carefully crafted so you can't do cycles.
So that was
that's
yeah, that was always my thing though like even in whenever it was still being called element queries and stuff, it's like there's ways to get around that. Like, for instance, like the flexbox stuff and the grid stuff, it's like you have rules that can be applied to like grid containers or whatever.
So that's what Matt's thing is about, right? So when you go to that thing, that's what we got to figure out. Like, what are those details?
Yeah.
Because
and that's where it gets into like weird web standards-y stuff I definitely don't know territory, where like, you know, as developers we're used to transmuting lead into gold. Like the rules get passed down from on high, and we'll turn you know, whatever we have to work with into incredible websites. So whenever this circular thing comes up, this recursion, everybody's just like, oh, so just drop it. So it goes through, it sets its width. If there's recursion, just stop. And I can't even begin to pretend to understand why this is. But when we bring that up to people who work on like CSS specs, they're like, no, CSS can never do that. CSS must never do that. And it's like, all right,
so working
it's cool, but that's why it makes it tough to kind of hash through in a vacuum. Like us devs, we can be like, this sounds great. We could have taken, like, if we hadn't done responsive images and we hadn't known the minefield we were walking into, we could have hauled off and spent a year like we did on the original picture element and like thought we were thinking all this stuff through 100%, gone to web standards and been like, here you are, Julia Child style. We prepared this one in advance, and had them be like, no, start over. You know? So that's why it's important to have a seat at the same table at the outset, but I haven't figured out how to do it yet.
So that's what we got to do with the repo that Matt shared, is get all those details accounted for. So, like, for us, you know, like we, like Matt said, like developers take the crappiest, most terrible APIs in the world and make these amazing things, right? That's the interesting thing is...
I make terrible things, but...
If you give us some raw materials and stand back, you'll be amazed at what we built with it, right? Like, it's always the case. It's not exclusive to the web. Like, if you saw my original presentation here, it's true of everything, right? Like, it's true of everything. It was true of electricity. It was true with like everything in the Industrial Revolution. When we got some new power to do something, the things that we did with it were not what people originally thought were gonna, like, that was a tiny portion of what people accomplished. So we all have in our mind a finite number of use cases that we think, oh, yeah, we could do that. But one of the challenges, like if you've ever actually developed an API and then spent like a year using it, well, you make your CSS, right? You design your CSS and like you spend a year using it, and then you get a client that's doing something, that wants to do something unexpected, and you go, oh, gee, man, I didn't really think about that. That doesn't really work, right? There's no room for that in web standards, right? There's no room for that. So we have to really, really think it through and specify it. So it seems really painful, but it's totally doable. We can do it. And I'm really happy that Matt is launching that effort with the container queries. And if you want to help, that GitHub repo is a really good way to do it. And if you want to maybe have some working sessions to discuss use cases and stuff like that, we can do those as either regular chapters meetings or like an in-between normal meetings. We're going to get together a couple of you. We can do that too. I think the goal is to contribute to that as much as possible. Does anybody have like questions like directly for Matt? I feel like I'm talking too much there.
If anyone is currently questioning the physical health or emotional well-being of that dog you heard shrieking earlier, sounding like it was dying, it's a Shiba Inu, and they do this thing called a Shiba scream. That's not a thing I made up, where when they are distressed by a very tiny noise in the hallway, they shriek like they're dying. This is a constant in my life, and I want to assure you that no animals were harmed during the course of this presentation. Sheba scream. Look it up on YouTube sometime. It's horrifying. It's like watching The Ring. Anyway,
So,
questions not about dogs.
yeah, I mean, does anybody have any thoughts or questions? Like, I'm sure you all came here with something that you were interested in hearing or thinking about with relation to this. Anybody want to share that and whether they got their questions answered? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, this is just me. I don't really do web development anymore, but this is just me dealing with this for years and years. You mentioned Firefox and Chrome. How about all the other people that don't necessarily care or just have their own roadmaps? How are we going to deal with them? And should they hesitate on adoption? How are you going to deal with the fallback of now there's a new library that if Chrome or Firefox do this thing, I'll just fall back to a crappy JavaScript solution?
Right. Yeah. Right. So that's not. We haven't thought that far through in terms of like how these things degrade, which is why when I point to like the requirements document, that's basically a framework for having those discussions. So an example of one of the requirements we put out there for responsive images, and this is using all like very specky language, was that there must, and that's the all caps web standards must, be a fallback pattern baked into this. So if a new browser doesn't support this pattern, it must fall back to a regular image element. We don't really have a framework for that discussion around container queries yet. We don't know, we haven't even started thinking through like how that might fall back at a native level. But one of the other requirements before we fully understood that about responsive images was the pattern should, and again, should has like special web standards meaning, be something that a developer can polyfill using JavaScript to some extent.
Right. So,
And that at least opens the door for like, if it's not supported, at least you can build something. But I think for the first part of your question, which was like, and correct me if I'm wrong, like if we get buy-in from, let's say, Chrome, what impetus is there for the other browsers? Was that kind of the question? Like what kind of holds their feet to the fire? Absolutely nothing. And it is, in my experience, it is super a game of influence. There are browsers who will not make a move until another browser does. There are browsers who won't make a move until a particular other browser does. And I'm not going to name any names because this is on the internet too. It's complicated. And this is, like if I had to put a single, like the biggest failing of web standards and the RICG's failing by extension, is that it's so very who you know. And like, the RICG became a part of that. Like I know who to pester with questions for feedback, who will give it to me like off the record. I know who has certain types of influence over what decisions, and that's so gross. Like I don't want to be the guy. I want a venue where anybody with a good idea can put it out there and have people be like, yeah, I'm into that too. Let's make this happen. But on the other hand, you know, and this I've talked to browser vendors about this plenty, believe you me, they just have so much shit to do that like, how do you prioritize? How do you keep an ear to Twitter and be like, people super want container queries, we better just haul off and do it. Then have people be like, actually, we didn't care all that much, but thanks for putting the time in instead of fixing bugs, you know? So it's such a weird finessey balancing act. And it's super political because it's people, you know how it is. And that's legit the best answer I have. It's not great. And that's why I think there is still a place for the RICG in this, because it is so very who you know. And hopefully we've now become one of the who's to know with an eye toward representing the developer and designer community a little bit more, you know? Ideally, we go away. We make ourselves obsolete, you know? Like a good polyfill. Eventually nobody needs us anymore, but for now we're a stopgap.
I got a question.
God, that's the smartest thing I've ever said. I should have trotted that out in a presentation years ago. That polyfill thing.
it's recorded,
That's
so
gold.
you can-
Anyway.
you can go back and write it down.
Yeah, really.
My question is kind of bouncing off of that, so it's going down the meta road a little away from CSS container queries. But like, what are the types of developers that are implementing these things in the browser engines versus the people that are actually using them? How do the people that are developing the browsers even like
By and
dog
large,
through their own stuff?
yeah, by and large, they're actually very different. So Matt and I both, the thing that he was talking about at Boku, I don't know when it was like last month, Matt. We ran breakout sessions. So we, basically the room split in half, and half the people went and talked about container queries, and half came and talked about chapters. And this was one of the things that came up, is that there's a huge disconnect right there, right? Like the Venn diagram, if you were to draw a Venn diagram that said these are people who implement the things in browsers, and these are the people who develop websites, there's very little overlap there. There's some, like Yoav actually is sort of both, right? Like there's some of the people who do work in Chrome or Whatwig, like they sort of do both, but the overlap is very small, and that creates a lot of problems because if you've ever done something for a client, you know that they'll ask you for the things that they want, and you'll say, well,
right.
That's really, I don't think you realize how hard that thing that you're asking for is. But if we just tone that down a little bit, I can make that much cheaper for you. And that kind of stuff happens all the time, and making that communication is sort of one of the things a lot of people are interested in from chapters, like can we get actual implementers to come talk to us? So I'm hoping that we open some roads for that.
Yeah. And like to advocate for browser reps, web standards is an incredible amount of work. Like that's a lot of work. That's their full-time job for a reason. Yeah. That leaves them like nights and weekends to tinker around in a code pen or put a blog together and kind of try out some of this stuff, But we don't transmute lead into gold for funsies as full-time 8 hours a day developers. We do it because that's our job. We have no choice. That stuff's kind of foisted on us a lot of times. So we kind of have to make the best of it. And that's what we were seeing a lot with those early responsive image solutions was like, well, just use the server. And I was like, I'm on a project where I can't. Like, this needs to be a markup thing. This needs to be something I can package up and ship around. And they were like, well, just use CSS. And I was like, have you ever wired up assets in a CMS to a CSS file? That's a nightmare. And they're like, just some other thing. And it's like, man, you ain't doing this. You're not doing this full time. I know this won't work, but like, that's where it was like, well, in the spec, this makes the most sense. And us being like, on the earth, this other thing makes the most sense. And that makes for a very big disconnect, My favorite example, and I hated it until I made sense of it, and then it made perfect sense to me, was, has anybody worked with border image?
A little.
Like the border image syntax in CSS? What a nightmare. What an inscrutable micro syntax where like one character means 9 different things, and it's just baffling, and there's literally no other way it could be after I got to know it. Like, this is the only way this can ever exist. But like, it's such a perfect example of like, this was spec first and practical after. And that's why no hands go up when I ask if people have used border image. But now having worked on specs a little, I 100% get how it ended up that way. Like, it couldn't have ended up any other way. It just doesn't count for anything,
Did that answer your question, Justin? Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Anything? Brad, you got nothing?
We got a question online.
Come on, man.
Innovating, like innovation without the
Okay,
ON.
so somebody
wants to know,
what
do you think of the research, syntax, demos, and CSS element queries spec proposal for container queries at elementqueries.com?
Did you hear that?
Container queries, element.
This is actually.
Say again, what's the URL?
Elementqueries.com.
It's elementqueries.com. So this is actually part of the reason that I wanted to draw that distinction, because there are things out there that are still selling as element queries, and those are separate efforts, and it's worth kind of looking at both of them to see why that is the case.
Yeah.
And maybe
I mean,
like come back and Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. Like, there's still a bunch of responsive images scripts out there, and anything like this helps prove the need. You know what I mean? But yeah, and I mean, I've read through a lot of stuff, and I know the dude who works on this has done a lot of spec work. Tommy Hodgins. It's Hodgins, I think. And like when things kick off in a major way in terms of getting the use cases and the spec together and everything, this is absolutely vital stuff. Like, this is someone else who has thought a bunch of this stuff through, and we absolutely need that. We just need tons of it. We need volume again. Like the RICG, no matter who was involved at the outset, when there were 15 of us, nothing happened because we weren't the chip leaders. You know, we didn't have the weight to throw around. Once it became a big enough deal, and that's how I end up writing blog posts and doing presentations like the one you're attending right now, we just need people's ears. We just need people to pay a little bit more attention to it and start. I said this in presentations about the responsive images stuff back when it was still going on. To be in the RICG, like technically you go to a website by way of the W3C website and you sign up, but like anybody who chipped in anything on GitHub or tweeted about it or whatever, or bought a dumb t-shirt, like they're actually very cool t-shirts. I don't mean that. That's unofficial RICG. Like that's what made this happen, was just having the numbers on our side. So yeah, efforts like this, hugely important. And now we have to kind of distill down a lot of this stuff into spec speak. Like, I know Tommy there was saying element queries specifically because it isn't strictly container queries. It's a lot of other things that are around that element. And those use cases may materialize more and more for the standard over time. But a lot of this we're going to have to just pre-chew a little bit for the web standards process. Like we may have to just say, okay, container queries for now, or focus on one part of this really hard as we start gaining a little bit of momentum. You know what I mean?
So earlier you asked a question, is John?
Yeah.
Okay, so John, I think actually, I don't know if Matt like agrees with me here or not, but I think probably he does. But I think this actually plays into the thing that you were asking. Like, okay, so what if Chrome blazes forward, and then Microsoft says,
right,
"Yeah, we're not interested," right?
Yeah.
So they got to pull in the same direction, right? And that can start out kind of rough at first, like this is a problem worth solving. We're going to work together. We don't know exactly what that is yet, but we'll get more clarity as we go. And the same is absolutely true here, right? So if we have 3 element queries efforts that are all pulling in completely opposite directions, that will probably not go over well because of the confusion that it will cause. But like there's room for some ideas to compete a little bit, but at some point, you know, we need to start,
they have to, otherwise it can't.
Joining things in, and that's exactly the same kind of challenge that I think it's really helpful to realize that you know, it's easy to look at browser vendors and be like, oh, it's jerks, why would they do that? Like, why can't they just work together? But like, you know, they all genuinely might think that things are like good or bad, and then they all have different sized teams, and they're all listening to different people who are saying different things are important, right? So managing all these things is actually really challenging. It's going to be really challenging here too, right? So, you know, if we don't do a good job, then the browser makers and the standards bodies will be like, screw those jerks, they can't agree on what they even want, right? They'll just flip it right back around. So, like, we have to, you know, we got to start roping it in together. So I know there's a number of efforts out there, and part of the challenge will be corralling them all into something where there's probably going to be compromise because, for example, the way that some of them are written requires a whole lot more fundamental change to CSS that stands a less likely chance of reaching the finish line. You know,
I work in the platforms and service space, and let me tell you all about Procfile and app.json and how there are 10,000 different variations of that,
Right.
and the requests we get all the time. Why can't you just support?
Right.
Why can't you just support Docker? What?
God,
It's like that.
any question with the word "just" in it involving anything even vaguely related to the internet, and right away I just shut down, and I wake up 5 hours later in the middle of a field, shirtless, covered in blood. It's very weird. It's very weird. It's a very Night Vale situation,
I don't think I've given a
and that's what happens.
I don't think I've given a presentation that hasn't included that XKCD comic where it's like, you got one guy who says, wait a minute, there's 14 different competing standards. This is insane.
Right.
We need just one that meets everybody's use cases. And then the result is
Mhm,
there's 15 competing standards, right? Because
Yep.
standardization is.
That's why I make a lot of reference.
Go ahead, man.
That's that I call the RICG like a rally point a lot, because we aren't a standards body. We have no right to do any number of the things that we do. And we're absolutely not any kind of decision maker. We're not here to thumbs up, thumbs down anybody's ideas on anything. But we're a flag you can fly if you wanna run things up the flagpole a little bit. So like maybe it gets in front of some browser vendors, and maybe they can look at it and be like, absolutely not, or maybe yes, which is the most affirmative you get for the most part early on in the standards process is maybe. So yeah, that's why like apps like this, the EQ CSS thing, there's tons of that. We're absolutely gonna, hopefully end up pulling into the use cases doc, future like polyfill for this, the actual specification potentially, but there's no way of saying just yet.
Cool. Anything else?
What's the right now as it stands? Like, let's play a fun game called hypothetical futures. Like, I guess where are browser makers now? Where is everything now? Like, you've lived through the images stuff, and that obviously took 4 or 5 years or something. The whole kit and caboodle.
Off of my life, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
As long as I've known you. So, is this a repeat of that? Like, I remember like Tab, like whenever the whole element queries thing came out, it was like Tab like spiked it down like a volleyball or whatever.
Tab Atkins.
Yeah, Tab Atkins.
People in
And
the
it
room.
was just like, no, we're not going, and that's what you were saying about sort of rebranding it, and that was all great and whatever. So it's like, where are they now as far as like, is it on their radar,
Gotcha.
or are they like still going like, yeah, put your heads together and like we'll talk whenever you have a clear point of view or something?
Before you answer, let me say Tab Atkins is Google's spec author for CSS. It's on the CSS working group. So just so you have that context.
Right.
Go ahead, man.
It's both is basically the answer there. It is on a handful of browser vendors' radars because I am obnoxious and would not allow it to not be on their radars. But it's still so early days that it's like, again, they got a lot of work to do. They got a lot of bugs to fix. They can't be like, yeah, let's dive into fixing this. So what does it do?
Right.
And us like,
Stuff.
hoping you could tell us.
Yeah.
Got it.
Oh,
So but like in terms of, that was a big part of the like, I published that ALA post 1,000 years ago now, and then it was super quiet. And part of that was because, and this is Tab who let me in on it, but a bunch of browsers are planning the same kind of thing. There are specs and development underway to allow us more access to like
yes, good.
native level stuff in the browser. Yeah, like more API-ish stuff to control how CSS itself works. That would be
So
effectively allow us to build our own container query scripts, like completely from scratch, and have them work in a way that makes sense without like regexing an entire style sheet, which is awesome, and I definitely want that. But part of the wait and see approach was like, that was kind of Google's answer, was you're going to get these and you can just build it, so don't worry about it. And we were like, okay, well, we'll hold off for a little bit and like see where these things go. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we end up needing. But from talking to a couple of other browser vendors, and I can't really name names there, in a big way. It is quietly semi-agreed upon that this is something that needs to live at like the native level. So let's say in a hopeful future world, which is a dangerous thing to talk about here in the year 2017. In a hopeful future world, we get access. Yeah, right. We get access to all those APIs and everything, and we can use that to build like the de facto, the picture fill of container queries. We can build like something that parses the native syntax that we eventually end up with and polyfills it 100%. We also get this native stuff. We also get container queries baked into CSS the way we want. Like in a perfect world, we have access to everything ever inside the browser. How that's going to shake out, I don't 100% know. But what it does mean is a lot of spec work is going on for a lot of the concerns that container queries will share. So that's progress in a way. That's stuff we can pull from. That's stuff we can point to and be like, you remember how it was really scary a year ago to think about how an element might have viewport-like behavior? How about that spec you're working on right now? That sort of outlines some of that. Could we use that? You know, and that sort of trudges us along a little bit. But I say trudge deliberately because it's taking forever, and that's why I think client work allowing, this stuff is going to kick off in a slightly louder and more browser peer pressure-y way soon.
So Brad, I know you were asking Matt and not me, but do you mind if I share my thoughts on the same question?
If Matt allows it.
Matt, what do you think?
I'll allow this, just this once.
So
proceed.
So I'm actually you asked, like, we know what it was like before and what's it like now, how, like, what are the odds, like how hard is it going to be, all that kind of stuff, right? So I will say that there is a large group of people that between Responsive Images Community Group and the Extensible Web Community Group that shook a lot of things up, right? The Extensible Web Community Group helped to get people elected to the W3C Technical Architecture Group. There have been like 32 seats or something like that up in the Technical Architecture Group. That's the steering committee for the W3C. And we've won all but one. Done the same for the advisory board, which is the thing that sets the policies for the W3C. And we have a voice, and we've helped shape that. So there's the Web Incubator Community Group. W3C has been very, like, increasingly attentive of how we need to do better at this. And just to add that last thing that we were talking about, when we were talking about this in our breakout session, Tim Berners-Lee, who is the director of W3C, invented the web. He said, this stuff that you're talking about, it's not the first time he said this, but I think it's the first time he said it in a public venue. The stuff that you're talking about, Brian, like, it's, what people don't see, and I want everybody to know, is that it's all just people, right? If you think, why does it work that way? That's crazy. That's not working. That's because we were trying, right? And if that's not working, tell us what you think we can do different, and we'll try, right? So I'm actually kind of bullish on a lot of things that have happened. One of the things that have happened is that it's not just container queries, there's a whole bunch of things in CSS that are currently really difficult. And basically, CSS is all or nothing proposal. You can't sort of peek down in and tweak this little part, right? You can't polyfill it easily, right? If we have a great idea for a new property or for a new selector, or we can't polyfill it. So having these people on the tag got us an audience, and one of the things that happened was the thing that Matt mentioned was a thing was created called the Houdini Task Force. It's a partnership of W3C Tag and the CSS Working Group, browser vendors, And what they're working on doing, what we're working on doing, I'm on that, is finding all these lower level things that would make all these things possible, specifying them and getting them spec'd out and getting stuff to participate. So we have custom properties. I don't know if you have looked at custom properties, but they're awesome. You look at on a tutor's feed for the past 2 weeks, every day she's showing new amazing things we do with custom properties. A new thing, custom paint is now a recommendation, I think. It's on the rec track anyway. That would allow you to, take something and put it into the paint bucket when when it's going through the rendering stuff. I'm really hopeful that we've put together a lot of things that will make this time easier than the last time in a lot of ways. If that's a really long-winded answer to your question.
You're doing the Lord's work.
So, anything else? No?
Matt, what's a pattern library?
It's when you're like, do you know Plaid? The Plaid when it does the thing? If you have like a bunch of those and you put them, you use like a glue stick and you put them in a book, that's scrapbooking. I'm thinking of scrapbooking. That's the one. Yeah, I don't know what the other one is then. I'm really into scrapbooking now.
It's like jQuery, right? Pattern library.
Yeah.
It's like that. I think it's mandatory. Yeah, you need to have jQuery installed before you can do literally anything.
Okay, so do we have any other questions for Matt? Okay, but everybody's real interested in participating in this, right? Like we're gonna go home and pull up that thing and then bookmark it and then come back 3 months later and maybe contribute.
Yeah. What's the GitHub repo again?
Yes,
Or is
we'll
that
share that in the code
Oh, great.
Yeah, we'll share that in the Slack channel and in the meeting invite,
Share it on video too,
and we'll share it
cool.
on video,
so that people can see.
and
Excellent.
we'll share it all over the place.
Right.
You'll be like,
Oh, and
not this
one
again, I've seen this
caveat.
happen. What's that?
One major caveat for this whole standards effort is that I will do absolutely nothing until I'm done playing the new Zelda game. None of this will happen. I will not allow it until I'm done playing Breath of the Wild. It's so good. It's so good. Anyway,
Horizon Zero Dawn's pretty good too.
Did you hear that?
what is it?
Horizon Zero Dawn.
Oh.
Thumbs
I've
up.
been hearing that, but I can't look away from Zelda. I actually have my Switch here on the desk. I haven't even been paying attention to this presentation. I'm just running around in temples and stuff. It's wonderful. It's the Zelda I've always wanted.
Okay, so thanks.
Anyway.
Matt. Right? So I think I've got like 15 minutes worth of stuff. If you want to stick around, or I'm gonna call it a night. It's up to you guys. It's 8:15.
Sure.
Okay, Matt, you're welcome to stick if you want, or you can bail.
I'm going to continue packing up my apartment for a move this week, so I am going to drop.
Okay, cool. Thanks again, Matt.
See ya.
Thanks, everybody.
See ya. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
Your pregnant sister.
Let's see how it is.
Just text Jeff.
Tell my sister I said hi.
See you, man. Good luck with everything.
Did you close that window?
No, I get it. No, I get it. I probably should just hire them.
All right, so who is here? None of you, right? None of you were here for the last. John Neal was our remote guest.
Mark is here.
You were here. Cool. Did you have a chance to play with that at all? Okay, so just really quick, what it is that heading elements in HTMLs, right? And in HTML5, you also have section elements, article elements, you have these semantic elements. So the really interesting thing is that in 1991, right, Tim Berners-Lee set up this mailing list, and he's like, I have this idea for this web thing where you stick out a mailing list. So he put up this mailing list, and the first message to the mailing list was test, right? And the second message to the mailing list was something like test again, right? And the third message to the mailing list was somebody saying subscribe. The fourth message to the mailing list was from Tim, and he said, okay, so here's what this is, and here's some things that I'm kind of not so sure about. So in there, he said, this heading thing is kind of weird, right? Maybe what you should have is a section tag, and then you should just have an H inside of it. And that way you would be able to say that's the heading for that section, everything's all clear. This H1, H2, like figure out where you're at and everything, it's kind of weird. And the way that we got there was through some weird evolution. I'll share some links, you can read about that if you want. But this has always been really a problem because if you create a atomic component, right, in your, you're probably gonna yell at me that I'm misusing that word, but in my CMS, right, and I say this is a thing that I want people to be able to like use in lots of contexts, or I want people to be able to include it in their templates. You know, they're writing some template stuff. It's a reusable component, and in it there's a thing that's a heading. Like this is a section that you can move around, and that thing's a heading. What H is it? How do you know? You can't know. This has always been a problem for the web. And in fact, there's a whole bunch of problems where you can make nonsense, and that means it's not meaningful. So people who use like accessibility technology, search engines, we're in this constant game that's like war games or something, right? Like we're trying to game the SEO is trying to game us. We're trying to keep it. We have one group of people who's trying to make it accessible, another group that's trying to make it pretty, and like they're all like chasing each other's tails in this vicious thing. So HTML5 had this thing called the document outline, and the idea was that we should fix that. There should be a way to generate a document outline that will let you use a heading that means contextually what it should mean, right? So there's just one thing. The what way created that, the what WG, they created that. It's in the what way spec. Then the W3C forked that spec, and they said, this stuff doesn't make sense, we need to change it. And then the W3C said, you should be able to validate that. People are going to want to see. You need an easy way to see. I put this crazy code in. What does that mean, right? So the validator implemented it, and they said, well, we're going to try and follow this spec. And then they said, golly, that spec doesn't make sense. And they said, well, what about this spec? And they said, that one doesn't make sense either. So what's implemented in there is neither of the other two, right? And now people have come along since and found still more things that they're like, golly, I don't know if this is right. So there isn't actually a definitive spec, and this created a new issue that went on for, I don't know, 18,000 or something like that. I mean, it was really crazy. Not that many, really, but like it just went on and on and on. And so what we're doing here is trying to determine what could we do. And one of the problems with that conversation is that it chases its tail, right? So the proposal that was made, the thing that was open, sorry, that is the wrong, oops. I'm not a Windows touchpad dude here. Not it. zoom out. See if we can. There's an example here. So the proposal that went up was that effectively, there are these sectioning things. So that's in all of the specs. There are these things that are about sectioning. There's maybe the body, they don't agree on that. Maybe main, they don't agree on that. But they agree that like section aside and nav, those are sectioning things, right? And like the proposal was it'd be great to just put an H, just like Tim said in 1991, right? Like just a section that has an H, and that would be the way we do it, and there you go. But the problem is that there's, for example, lots and lots of legacy content, and there's lots and lots of things that are pervasively hard, like a lot of CMSs use Markdown, right? So in Markdown, you just say, hash this thing, hash this thing. You don't put sectioning things around them. So you get one person saying it should be like this, and then somebody else says, yes, but what about this? And then somebody says, yes, but that's not a problem because of this. And you wind up all the way back where you started, and then nobody can agree on what's the important things or how do we weigh them. So we decided to begin this, which is to collect, not sure what the technical word is, shit ton, I guess, of just ways that headings are used, right? So this one is basically like just straight HTML, right? So you have how do you
blog post or something, right? Just like a passage of text.
can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so you have a heading, and a paragraph, and then an H2, and then a paragraph, and then an H2, and like that's like as simple as it gets. That's what, and when we think about it, we go, well, sure, all of this stuff is under the H1, right? And then this stuff is just under there, and then you have an H2, and it has this. You have another H2, and it has this. One of the really interesting things about this is that like there's no way to kind of pop back out, right? So there's no way to be in H2 and then you need a little bit more H1 for your next H2. There's no way to do that. So that's all this is just bits of markup that you think create a potentially different sort of situation. Here's one, maybe like Bradville. Yeah, cards, right? So this is a common pattern, right? Like you have a card with some heading in it, right? So, well, what's under the H4? Where did the H5 go, right? Like, so somehow, if you have a document outline, it needs to either try to understand this stuff or not understand it or some hybrid of those things. And the only way that we can really discuss it is to first collect a whole bunch of use cases of even fairly crazy ways that people think they can use headings. So my thing here is the same as Matt's, is like I would really like to share this with you, and if you can contribute some use cases, things you've seen in the wild, like, or if you want to get together and have a cup of coffee and sit with a whiteboard, or maybe at a future we have a working session where we try to collect them and write them. Because the next step, once we have this, is we have 2 polyfills currently that we'll plug in, and we'll make a test environment where you can take these things and see, given this proposal, this is the impact, this is what you get. And then we need people to look at it and go, looks good to me, or what the hell is that thing, right? Like, so that's it. That's it. I'll share these on GitHub too. Anybody have any questions about that? Or yeah,
I'm gonna ask a really ignorant one because I've only been
there's
doing this
no
for
such
like,
thing in this.
for like 2 months.
Yeah.
So I'm still extremely green. But it just seems to me, and maybe this is an example of that, that a lot of times when I see the headers being used, it's more for the size or the format
Yeah.
more
Absolutely.
than as an organization.
Or SEO, right? Or SEO. People
Yeah.
go, well, Google's going to do something with that.
Yeah.
You
So
betcha.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it just seems like people are a lot of maybe frequently. I honestly don't know the scope because I haven't done it enough.
Mhm.
But it just seems to me like they're using it more as like a formatting tool than an organizational tool,
Yeah.
which it sounds to me like your drive here is to maybe push back more in the other direction, to use it more as an organizational tool.
So
Would that be incorrect or?
no, it's not. It's not incorrect. I'll share my article actually that sort of explains the position on this. So this is actually my own position, is that these are actually talking about different things. Like, it may have been the intent of Tim Berners-Lee in 1991 to fix this and make sections with headings, but we clearly didn't do that, and it's kind of hard to retroactively fix a bajillion use cases where people wrote all kinds of crazy shit that chase their tail, right? It chases their tail because somebody says, well, I'm going to use this one because it has some styling impact, it's a little easier to style. Somebody else says, no, we're going to use this because this. Somebody else says, no, we can't do that because we're affected by our CMS. And you just go around and around and around. So yeah, I kind of posit that these are sort of different but related ideas, and that it would make sense to chase that dragon instead. But the only way we can know that for sure is to have a lot of data that backs that up. And so there are a number of people who think that this is like algorithmically fixable. There are algorithms that tell you what to do in all these cases. The trouble is, how good are they? Well, we don't know because we don't have the inputs to run through them. So that's what we need. We need a bunch of inputs that we can run through those, and then we can see how good are those algorithms. Like, yeah.
Also, to sort of build on your point about, like, a lot of people will reach for different levels of headings for stylistic reasons. That certainly was the case, like, in the early days of like Css and stuff, whenever like you couldn't do stuff. It's like, I want this to be smaller, I'll make it an H5. And so a lot of people would do that. And I'd say that the sort of web standards movement, like separating HTML with CSS for style and stuff like that, like helped. I'd say that, just sort of like bird's eye view of like the industry, I'd say that a lot of people would understand that it's like, oh, I can use CSS to style these things differently. But that doesn't, like this, what's on your screen right now is not that uncommon whatsoever.
Exactly,
I mean, like
right.
I'll write things that are like, maybe not an H4 and an H6, but an H2 and an H3 for a heading and a subheading for a card. Or maybe it's an H3 and an H4. Sure, I'll write that.
Yeah.
No problem.
And that's my point, is that it's not crazy, right? Like, it's
Right.
not.
Yeah, no,
And you will get some of the best
that looks
people.
like my code.
You'll get, it might be your code, I don't know.
Yeah, no, but I mean, like, I would say
Oh, no,
I wouldn't
it's
skip like H4 to an H6 or something, but like adjacent ones, sure. I guess like my thing would be like, it's totally not to pop the balloon, but it's like, I know that like with screen readers and stuff, like you have the ability to like jump to headings and stuff like that. Like how harmful is that code right there? And or like how what are the gains of having like an H? But even in this scenario, it's like if you just had a general H, then what do you make of the H6 below it? You know, what does that become? There's like stuff like that I'm thinking of, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is actually one of the questions. So one of the things that like I point out in my article is that like in this case you have an H4, right? Forget that there's an H6. This is just an H of some kind, a normal HN tag.
Yep.
Right? We're like we look at this and we go, well, this is the head. It's heading this div.
Yep.
But they don't know from that div. That div is meaningless, right?
Right.
So we have like this content over here, and this content over here, and this content over here, and we set out these things for which there isn't a logical explanation for that, right? And one of the things that, like, imagine that I send you this on your cell phone, and I say, yeah, it's just like, I don't know what it is, it's my contact information or something like that, right? And it's in the middle of a page, and I send you this thing, and I say, hey, Brad, you'll find my contact information under contacts in this page, right? In the contact section of this page. You're driving down the road, and you say, Siri, read me the contact section. Siri's like, what contact section?
Right.
Right? So this is one of the things, like when we talk about screen readers, what we're really talking about is something that just understands the
Right.
non-visual.
Interprets.
Right?
Right.
And increasingly, you are using technology that relies on the same thing.
Right.
You want to talk to Siri, you want to talk to Alexa, you want to use your game system, anything that wants to understand that, right?
Right.
But to the question, how much better would it be, or what should it do? Should it be able to tell you what the actual section is? These are all questions that, as a group, we can talk about and agree or disagree, but without data, we just go in circles,
Right.
So we need a whole bunch of data. We need polyfills for the ideas. We have to, I'm not sharing them until we collect a whole bunch of use cases. We have to, one that's very close to the, sort of like, it's very close to the validator one, let's say it like that, right? On W3C validator one. And then we have one that is like, okay, that was a nice idea, but here's a simpler one that gives more answers, but doesn't deal with this stuff. Like, once we have a whole bunch of input, we can set up a system where you can compare them, right? Like you can look at them and look at the data and say, give me this one, which one of those or neither makes sense and why on which use cases. So that's something like collecting a use case, I think, is not that hard. Like you can probably on the drive home tonight think about, I mean, especially you, because like, you know, you have a lot of like thought into patterns like cards and things like that, but you probably can come up with some that, here's 5 of them, you know, just collect them, add them in, if you have an hour or half an hour or on the weekend, whatever, add some use cases. And then once we have a system where you can test, that's easy, right? We tweet that, everybody tweets it, and we just collect feedback, right? What do you think? Is that intuitive? It's not intuitive. And then we have to kind of give special weighting to people who actually primarily use assistive technology so that we can get their sense of, from that specific perspective, is that a better or worse experience? Yeah, that's it. So we actually went 20 minutes. I didn't mean to take that long. But
Awesome. Thanks for sharing.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I hope you all. Can I X this?
Yeah, close that. And let me also. That's right. The streams are just not much.